Welcome back folks to yet another Rank 'em All video, and in these videos we rank the full discography from different metal bands, and today we're going to take on Queensryche's full discography. Queensrÿche is an American heavy metal band that has released 15 studio albums to date, and they are one of the most successful American metal bands of all time, and over their 40-year-long career they have sold over 20 million records. The band gained worldwide success with the release of their 1988 concept album Operation Mindcrime, that was followed up with the multi-million selling record Empire. But after that it all went downhill for the band for various reasons. So if you're a Queensryche fan or enjoy my content, then smash that like button and subscribe with the bell notifications turned on. Because now it's time to rank Queensryche's full discography from the worst to the best, so let's do this. The worst Queensryche album is in my opinion dedicated to Chaos from 2011, and this was the last Queensryche album to feature their longtime vocalist Geoff Tate, the only man that had fronted the band up until this point, because he was fired from the band in an infected battle between him and the other band members. And I really wish that I could say that Geoff went out with a bang, but that would be lying since Dedicated to Chaos is a highly mediocre album. So maybe the split was for the best, even if Geoff Tate in his prime was one of the best vocalists that the world had ever seen. But Dedicated to Chaos is not only a bad album, it's actually one of the worst albums that I've ever heard from a band that I used to respect. This one is almost on that Saint Anger level, so let's do what Queensryche did and just move on. Next. In 14th place we have Operation Mindcrime 2 from 2006, and before we start talking about the record, just naming it Operation Mindcrime 2 puts a lot of expectations on the album, because Operation Mindcrime was a masterpiece, and trying to make a follow-up album some 18 years later that can live up to the hype is almost impossible, especially when their latest efforts hasn't been up to the right standard. And I'm sorry to say this, but this album was a failure of monumental proportions. It's worse than the original Operation Mindcrime in every plausible way. I mean, I almost laughed when I heard this album the whole way through for the first time. And even if this is a more metal sounding album than their previous records, it still comes out as a bigger train wreck somehow. And Ronnie James Dio lends his vocals to the track The Chase, but I think it's one of the worst songs that Ronnie James Dio has ever appeared on. So not even Dio could save Queensryche from themselves. Operation Mindcrime 2 is certainly a disgrace, and I hope I never need to listen to the album ever again, so next. In 13th place we have American Soldier from 2009, and this is Queensryche's 11th studio album if you count the cover album Take Cover, that came out 2 years prior to the release of this album. American Soldier tells the story of war from a first-hand perspective, and I'm gonna tell you what's up. This album sucks, just like the rapping in the very first track called Slaver. I mean, there are just so much great metal out there, both old and new, so I don't see a reason for me to listen to this album ever again, even if the war stories were touching to some degree. I mean, the music just don't speak to me, and I seriously doubt that the band gained any new fans with this record. So, next. In 12th place we have Here in the Now Frontier, which came out in 1997. And I was only familiar with about half of Queensryche's discography before deciding to rank their albums. So over the last couple of weeks I've been spinning the post-Promised Land era of the band, so that I could get a good grip of their full discography. And when I put this record on for the first time, it was kind of a shock. I had of course heard that the post-Promised Land albums were bad, but this album was confusing for me when I first heard it. I mean, it was still the same lineup that recorded the Warning and Operation Mindcrime, and then they put out a record like this that sounded more or less like the generic stuff that you heard on the radio back then. I mean, this album came out when the grunge era was fading away, but this still reminds me of bands like Alice in Chains, Soundgarden and even Foo Fighters. but with more classic rock vocals from Geoff Tate, whose singing just ain't as impressive here. This album is highly skippable, unless you're really into that Seattle sound. Next. In 11th place we have Q2K, which came out in 1999, 2 years after the Here and the Now Frontier. And just like that album, this album has this alternative rock vibe to it. But there is also some bluesy hard rock here. Guitarist Chris DeGarmo left the band to become an airline pilot, and in his place stepped Kelly Gray, who had played with Geoff Tate in his pre-Queensrÿche band Myth. And I would say that I prefer this album over their last record, but this is still far from the great band that I once fell in love with, so next. In 10th place we have Frequency Unknown from 2013, and this album came out after the split between Geoff Tate and the rest of the band. And in retrospect, this might not count as a Queensrÿche album, since this is Geoff Tate's version of Queensrÿche, and he lost the rights to use the band name after this album came out. Geoff Tate's version of Queensrÿche featured several known faces, such as Queensryche's former guitarist and producer Kelly Gray, but also known names within the metal community, such as Glenn Rover, Rudy Sarzo and Simon Wright. And there were also several guest appearances on this album. The title FU, short for Frequency Unknown, was seen as a message to his former bandmates, so the relation between the vocalist and his former bandmates were stale to say the least. But what about the album then? Well, it's some sort of rock album, so it's a bit uninteresting to me personally. It's well produced and all, but it's just not a metal album. And this version of the band continued on under the name Operation Mindcrime, after Geoff Tate losing the legal battle to the name Queensrÿche. So, next. In 9th place we have Tribe, that came out in 2003, and the band had a deadline to work with when they recorded this album, and they didn't have enough material, so they called in their ex-guitarist Chris DeGarmo, who decided to write some songs for the upcoming album, which he did, and then he left the band before the album was released. And this was also the last time that Chris DeGarmo contributed to the band. But not even his presence could help the band out of the rut that they were in. The album did rather terrible, and the band only sold 75,000 copies in the first 5 years of the album's existence. Put that in comparison to Empire, that sold over 3 million copies in the US alone. And to me this isn't surprising, since the quality of their outputs of late hasn't been up to the right standard. Plus Geoff Tate is getting older, and his voice just don't sound as good as it used to. They might be of the same tribe, but this is not the same band as it once was, so next. In 8th place we have Queensryche's 13th studio album Queensrÿche from 2013. This was the band's first album with a new vocalist, Todd La Torre, so this was something of a rebirth for the band, and new in the lineup was also guitarist Parker Lundgren. And in the very first track, Where Dreams Go to Die, you can instantly hear an improvement on just about everything that the band has put out in the last 20 years. Todd La Torre is a great singer who Queensrÿche snapped up from Crimson Glory, and he might not be Geoff Tate in his prime, since there is only one Geoff Tate, but I think that Todd does a great job here, and his vocal performances on this record is better than anything that Geoff Tate has done in a long time. And at times their voices are eerily similar, so you kinda forget that the band had a new singer. And the first time that I heard Todd was actually when they did a song with the guys in Metal Church for the re-recording of Fake Healer in 2017. So I knew that he was a competent singer, but I thought that Queensrÿche was long past their prime, so I didn't even bother to check out this album when it came out. But since then I have come to enjoy this record. I think that their self-titled album is their best since 1994's Promised Land. The band ditched that weird hard rock sound of their last couple of records and went back towards a more old school metal sound, which I'm real happy with. So welcome back, Queensrÿche. And I just thought that the album was a bit on the shorter side since it's only 35 minutes long. And do I think that their self-titled album can compete with their best albums? No, but this was still a giant leap in the right direction. So, next. In 7th place we have Promised Land from 1994. And it was here that the changing times started to catch up with Queensrÿche, because the band took a big step away from the metallic sound of their previous records, and this album ends up somewhere in the progressive hard rock section, I would say. The song Damaged is probably the closest thing to a metal song from this record, but not even that track is especially hard. It's like they took the worst ideas of Empire and they added some inspiration from bands like Rush and Led Zeppelin, and then they infused some 90s weirdness to the album. There is a lot of acoustic guitars and melodic leads on this album, and I think that Promised Land was the album that bridged the gap between the classic era of the band with the late 90s and early 2000s era that is hardly even appreciated by the band's most loyal fans. And Promised Land has an almost hypnotic and soothing feeling to it. And while not reaching the heights of its predecessors, I'd still place it on the top half of their discography. So, next. In 6th place we have The Verdict from 2015, and this is another solid album from Queensrÿche. It's their 3rd album with Todd La Torre, who does not only sing on the album, but he also plays the drums on this record, due to their drummer Scott Rockenfield has been missing in action for some mysterious reason. And if you like the other albums with Todd La Torre, Condition Human and their self-titled album Queensryche, then this album should be right up your alley. It's just more of the same here. But it has a slightly more modern production this time around. And I think that this is a great album, and since it's their latest to date, I'm really looking forward to see what the band can come up with next. So, next. In 5th place we have Condition Human, which came out in 2015, and it's the 2nd album with their new vocalist Todd La Torre. So it was great to see Queensrÿche back again with Todd, since their last album showed a lot of promise, even if it was a bit on the shorter side. And luckily for us fans, Condition Human continues down the same path. It's impressive that the band finally managed to dig themselves out of the pit that they were in for almost 20 years, even if this is not exactly like the good old Queensrÿche, but I think that the new Queensrÿche is pretty damn good. It's just well produced heavy metal with great melodic singing, and guitar-wise this is real impressive. The band hasn't sounded this good since the Chris DeGarmo days. And this album did impress me quite a bit. So, what's next? Maybe Metallica can come back and deliver a great thrash metal album again, because everything feels possible after listening to this triumphant return to form. Next. In 4th place we have Empire from 1990, and this was the band's 4th full-length studio album, and it came out 2 years after Operation Mindcrime. So there are some similarities to that album, but it's also a bit different. There are some weird keyboards and orchestrations on this record that would probably throw off some fans of their 80s catalog, and I would personally prefer if they had toned that down a bit, but it's not like it completely ruins the record. The band built up a bigger and bigger following, and it all culminated here in terms of the band's popularity. I mean, 2 of their biggest hits are on this record. Silent Lucidity was a monster hit, and it was on repeat on MTV. And Jet City Woman was also huge. And those 2 songs are also the top 2 most played Queensrÿche tracks on Spotify. And they did of course record music videos for those 2 as well. But even if I like Empire, I don't think it's as strong as The Warning or Operation Mindcrime. I would even describe it as a move away from metal and more into the progressive hard rock field. I've even heard some people call this a glam metal record, but I don't throw out insults like that so easily, even if the album has a light airiness to it that some glam records had during the late 80s and early 90s. Empire might not be their best album, but it's from the classic period of Queensrÿche, before their empire crumbled, so you owe yourself to at least check this album out. So, next. In third place we have Rage of Order from 1986, and it was here that the band got the progressive metal tag that they've worn proudly ever since. Even if Rage for Order isn't a concept album, there are several songs referring to the technological awakening, like I Dream in Infrared or Screaming in Digital. The band's sound has developed quite a bit since the release of the EP and The Warning, that were more or less traditional US power metal. The production and Geoff Tate singing is great here, even if the album is a bit light and experimental at times. The song Gonna Get Close to You, in which the band covered Lisa Del Bello, is just weird. I always skip that track when listening to the album, because it has this 80s post-punk sound to it, and I just can't stand listening to it. Rage for Order came out in 1986, between The Warning and Operation Mindcrime, and that's what it sounds like too. The album has more of an airiness to the production than The Warning, and the album ain't as paranoid as Operation Mindcrime. And the choruses aren't as sticky either, except in the song Walk in the Shadows, a song that will stick in your head whether you like it or not. Rage for Order was a step towards a more creative territory for the band, and in the long run they kind of went out of steam, but for now it was all good, so next. In second place we have Operation Mindcrime. Yeah, it's not my number one, I know it's shocking, right? But I think that Operation Mindcrime is rightfully hailed as a masterpiece, and it's without a doubt one of the best, if not the best concept album in metal. It's at least up there alongside King Diamond's Abigail. The story follows Nicky, an addict to his disillusion with society, so much that he becomes involved with a group of revolutionaries that targets political leaders. And I get some 1984 vibes from it, even if it's not exactly the same topics. Operation Mindcrime might not be the heaviest album that I've ever heard, but the musicianship and the whole overarching story is amazing, and Geoff Tate is of course one of the best singers out there. And this was the first album that I've heard from the band after seeing it being discussed as one of the best metal albums of all time. But it took me some time to get into the album, since it was outside the usual thrash and heavy metal stuff that I was mostly listening to at the time. There's a lot of great songs on this album, like Revolution's Calling, the title track Operation Mindcrime, Eyes of a Stranger, heck, even the ballad I Don't Believe in Love is great. Yeah, you never thought you'd hear me say that, but I just did. And I think that Operation Mindcrime is pretty much an absolute essential record for anyone who's into 80s metal, hard rock and progressive metal, or anyone with functioning ears really. It's just one of those universally liked albums. So, next. The number one Queensrÿche album is in my opinion 1984's The Warning. Yeah, I hold this album even higher than the masterpiece Operation Mindcrime. The Warning was the band's full-length debut, and it came out a year after the release of the Queensrÿche EP. An EP that I most definitely would put in my top 3. But I don't rank EPs here, I'm just telling you guys to not miss out on it, since it's one of the best metal EPs of all time. And The Warning is in a similar style, incredibly well produced 80s metal. I really love everything about this record. The songwriting is remarkable, and Geoff Tate, his performance on this record, might be the best singing that I've ever heard in my whole life. I've been a fan of Dio, Dickinson and Halford for a long time, but Geoff Tate in the 80s was just a step above all of those, if that's even possible. His voice is so clean and he can hit those high notes without any effort. And do yourself a favor and check out the Queensrÿche Live in Tokyo video from 1984. It's on YouTube, and Geoff can really hit the high notes better live than most other singers do in the studio. And many of my favorite Queensrÿche songs are from The Warning, like the title track The Warning, Enforza, Deliverance and Take Hold of the Flame. And they even managed to make a softer track like No Sanctuary pleasant listening. And this might be my favorite American heavy / power metal album of the 80s, alongside Metal Church's debut. The lyrics were also a bit different here in comparison to what most other bands were doing at the time. It was a mix of technology gone wrong, sci-fi, politics, and even some fantasy. And the musicianship is also top notch here. Michael Wilton, Eddie Jackson, Scott Rockenfield, Chris DeGarmo, and did I mention Geoff Tate? Yeah, I think I did. So let's have a look at my full rank of their albums then. And when we have their full body of work in front of us, what strikes me the most is that the period from the mid-90s up until Geoff Tate leaving the band was a dark period that lasted for almost 20 years. And those albums just aren't up to the right standard for different reasons. Geoff Tate's voice deteriorating, Chris DeGarmo leaving the band, trends in the music business, smaller budgets, etc. etc. So it became a downward spiral for Queensryche, but when Geoff Tate was fired and Todd La Torre took over the microphone, Queensryche started to go in a more metal direction again, inspired by the band's first couple of records. So if you're one of those fans that lost interest in the band, you should definitely give the Todd La Torre albums a chance. And if you're not familiar with the band at all, you better check out albums like The Warning, Operation Mindcrime and Rage for Order. And don't forget about their debut EP. If that one was a full-length album, it would have been a contender for the top spot on this ranking. And now I'm curious to hear about your opinions on Queensryche and their catalog. Are you like me a fan of their early period and the Todd La Torre albums, and don't really care that much for the mid-era of the band? Because I don't know if I've ever met a Queensryche fan that really enjoyed those records. They are definitely a rare breed. So let me know your favorite Queensryche albums down below, and feel free to give me your rank of these albums if you're familiar with them. And if you enjoyed this video, then smash that like button and subscribe with the bell notifications turned on, so you won't miss out on future content here on the channel. And if you want to support my work, then you can throw me a few dollars through Patreon like these fine gentlemen, or go and grab yourself some merch at the Ruthless Metal store. I'm also on Facebook, Spotify and Discord, and you can find all those links listed down below. And let me know whose discography I should rank in the next Rank 'Em All video. And that's it folks, so thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye bye.